Okay. So I am Terry Helton. I am the chair of the Ventura County Interfaith Community, and I welcome you tonight on behalf of the Ventura County Interfaith Community to one of our events that we've been doing all during COVID. It's been a gift to us, and I hope to you too. One of the things we ask at the beginning is that everybody mute themselves unless they are the speaker, and that way we keep background noise down. Sometimes phones get in the way, that dogs bark, so it would be appreciated if you could mute yourselves. And then I hope you enjoy this tonight. We've had some great forums. The last one we did on the subject was amazing, and I expect this one to be good too. So the best way to keep informed about any of the forums or events we're doing is to go to vcic.info. That's vcic.info, and you will find all the events there. You will also find previous events listed that you can view via YouTube, and there's some really good ones. I just want to remind you that we are recording the forums, so you can find them on that site. And we do take stock in what you say. So after the speakers, we will have before the question and answer time, Tim will put in the chat a link for a survey to find out how you heard about us and what you're thinking about tonight and how you've enjoyed the speaker. Don't go away after that, because there will be a good question and answer time. And at this time, also I would like to remind you that we will have a question and answer time, and that those questions should go in the chat. I take them out and try to categorize them to keep them in a group order so that we're not swinging the pendulum from one side to the other, and we can keep an orderly thought process there. So at this time, I will introduce the moderator, who this evening happens to be my husband. And Tim Helton holds a PhD and a Master of Science from Drew University, where he specialized in anthropology of religion, and has a Master's of Arts in Theological Studies from Claremont School of Theology. He has done fieldwork amongst Jains in the United States as well as in India. His dissertation compared the attitudes and their theological underpinnings towards consumerism amongst Jains and Christians. Tim is a member of St. Columba's Episcopal Church, a founding member of the Ventura County Interfaith Community, and serves on the board of Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, and the board for Ventura County, and the board of United Parents. At this time, and by the way, the best part is he's my husband of 48 years. So take it away, honey.
And you are the only one I will call honey on this call. But to turn our attention to the subject and away from our 48 years of marriage, once again this evening, we turn our attention to the thorny issue of why suffering exists in a world governed by a loving God. The academic term for the problem is theodicy, but for those who have lost a loved one or live with daily pain, the problem is far from academic. In June, we considered the Buddhist idea that suffering results from a karmic burden carried from one life to the next. A rabbi suggested that God, whether by choice or by nature, is not all-powerful, and thus suffering occurs in spite of God's best intentions. And a Christian priest urged that whatever the reason for suffering, God suffers with her creation. Tonight, we revisit the issue from three additional perspectives. Our panelists this evening, sorry about that, it's hard to admit people and talk at the same time. Our panelists this evening, beginning with the oldest tradition and proceeding to the newest, include an imam, a Quaker, and a member of the Bahá'í community. We begin then with a presentation from the Islamic faith. Muhammad Shuaib Matar is an imam at Islamic Center of the Caneo Valley in Thousand Oaks. He is a regular guest speaker at local colleges and universities, and works closely with the police departments in order to share a better understanding of Islam. While living and working in Utah, Muhammad had been part of a yearly interfaith prayer session at the Utah Senate, representing the Muslims of Salt Lake City as an honored guest of the various mayors and the governor. He's active in presenting Islam in a mild and moderate manner. Imam Mehtar holds a degree in interpersonal and organizational communication. He has also memorized the Quran and has a degree in Islamic jurisprudence from Arabia Islamia, Johannesburg, South Africa. Through his writings, Imam Muhammad Shuaib has contributed to the discussion of issues relating to Muslims in the West and is ardent about representing contemporary Islamic thinking without letting go of core Islamic concepts and principles. He lectures extensively to student and secular groups, with key issues being in the area of personal reform, social reform, protecting the environment from continual abuse, social justice, and the need for continual intercultural and interfaith dialogue. Imam Muhammad, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Ventura County Interfaith Community Forum on why suffering exists in the presence of a loving God. And it's all yours.
Thank you very much for having this program to begin with. I think it is very much needed, especially in light of what we have just been through, COVID, for example, and its impact on each one of us. And there is not a single individual that has not been impacted by this, young or old, and its effect continues as we continue to even have this dialogue. On the one hand, you see the likes of COVID. On the other hand, you see other tragedies that are taking place in the world. From time to time, you'll hear of tsunamis, droughts. Right now, as we are talking, in certain parts of the world, there is tremendous amount of rainfall, and people's lives, what we will say is their lives are being damaged. And this poses a question generally, especially when you look at it from the point of view of our youth. They ask questions like, well, if you tell us God is loving, God is kind, God is compassionate, God is our creator, then why do you see all the suffering around? Why do we see cancer? Why do we see young children dying? Why is there injustice in relationships sometimes? The one that has the better lawyer sometimes wins the case, even though they are more corrupt. And the one that has a better lawyer may never even go to church or mosque or the synagogue. And their spouse that is going to the synagogue, church or mosque, etc., is the one that feels that they are being let down. And all these challenges, I think we can all relate to in some form or the other, sometimes makes us ask the question, and it doesn't make us because we are mature, it'll at least make a child ask the following question, or the younger generation, or those individuals that are not inclined to God as much, that what am I worshiping for? Is your God really helping you? Is your church, is your mosque, is your synagogue bringing you any benefit? For this, we have to turn, of course, naturally, as a Muslim, I have to turn towards the Quran and ask, what does the Quran say about this? And I'll just share with you an ayah of the Quran. I'll read it for you in Arabic, where God says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون. That whatever corruption you see, God is saying, whether it's on the earth or the skies, in the form of, for example, airplane disasters, space shuttle disasters, whatever it may be. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. As humans, you have to take responsibility that you are part and parcel of the corruption or of the wrong that is taking place. And when you see the corruption and wrong that is taking place, and thereafter you see a punishment coming about, God says, I place that punishment upon you, not because I hate you, not because I despise you. So it is placed upon you, in other words, the punishment or the challenge or whatever it may be, is so that you may reflect as to what is going on. So this way you may be able to turn towards God inevitably. Let's go to the first example. I use the word space shuttle. It was a disaster that took place. It was a tragedy. And as people will sometimes ask the question, Why is God insulting the intelligence of humanity? When the space shuttle disaster took place, many people that were anti-American found it now a moment to attack America. Oh, they think they are so smart, they're trying to challenge God, and that is why they're setting the space shuttle up. And various religions had a lot to say about it. The reality was, the reason why, and according to research, the reason why the Challenger went up into flames was because, as the Quran says, Aydin nas, because of the hands of the people. Meaning the people were told there were certain flaws over there. There are certain things that need to be put right. The space shuttle must not take off. But no, they wanted to go on the timeline that they had planned. And as a result, there was a tragedy. So when the tragedy took place, as people of faith, what do we say? We don't say things like, why are you challenging God? God has given us brains. God has given us the ability to make these things, whether it's airplanes, trains, whatever it may be, space shuttle. So we have to ask ourselves, when we are making these things and we are part of it, why am I part of it? Is it to say that science is great? Or is it to say, wow, God is magnificent. God has given us intellect. God is showing us what's not only on the earth, but what's beneath the earth and what is above the earth as well. So again, coming back to the topic at hand, tragedies take place, not because God hates us, not because God does not love us. Tragedies take place because God wants us to reform, and God wants us to reflect upon the great treasures that God has placed out to us out there. So that's the first point we want to make regarding the aspect of when tragedies come, what it should do for us. Second thing our religion teaches us, whenever a tragedy comes by, either A, you have patience, or B, you will have the lack of patience. It's obvious, patience or the lack of patience. When a tragedy comes by and you are able to reflect and you are able to sort of, as I say, take a step back and ask, why did that accident take place? Why is there starvation in the world? Why are resources being shared in such a lopsided manner? Why did the plane go down? Why is the imam always angry? I don't know. Whatever the question is, the main thing is this. If you can deal with that response by taking a step back and improve the situation in front of you, then in reality, that was not really a challenge in an adverse manner, but rather it was a challenge to make you a greater person. It's hard to realize this. For example, a person loses a father at a young age. A person loses a mother at a young age. A person loses a child at a young age. How do you step back? But little do we realize that that is the time, whenever we step back, it gives us now a form of reflection. And at the same time, although it looks like suffering from the one that's looking at it from outside, in reality, it is not a suffering for the one that is part of it. It's a very important point religion makes, because if my wife dies or my child dies and I say, you know what, I am sad, and religion says be sad for 3 days. It doesn't say be sad till the point where you go on Prozac, or go be sad to the point wherein you lose all your bearings. No, religion is saying that your sadness is a reality. Embrace it, no more than 3 days, and thereafter knock it out of you. So this way you can start moving in the direction that God wants you to move towards. That brings me now to the third point, and I purposely will end a little bit shortly, so this way I don't take my full 15 minutes, so this way there can be more time left for us at the end. So the first point I've made was very, very clear, that these things are all to get us back on track. Hard to understand at times, especially when you're going through tragedy, but this is what it's all about. Get us back connected to God. And of course, the second point I've made is, if you are able to better evaluate the challenges that you are going through, and it becomes a form of development and solace in a unique manner, then you have done remarkable. And point number 3, if we claim to be believers, There's a hadith, a tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that says that the greatest test takes place to the greatest believers. The greatest test is for the greatest believer. The more you are willing to give yourself to God, God is asking, are you genuine in what you are saying? You say you love God, but is it that you just say you love God because you live in $1 million house? It's easy to love God when you have $1 million home. It's easy to love God when you don't have medical bills to pay. It's easy to love God when everything is great. But how about, God forbid, if a fire comes by? Then what's your reaction? It doesn't mean we don't go through pain. Yes, we go through pain, but how do we react? How do we now reconcile what God has brought my way? So in reference to the third point, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that the greatest test goes through the greatest believers. And the greatest believers that have ever been tested were all the prophets. Muslims believe in Abraham, and we know the test of Abraham. We know the test of Ishmael. We know the test of Isaac. We know the test of Noah. We know the test of Moses. We know the test of Jesus. And the various, we believe in over 123,000 prophets. And we believe many of them were tested to the point wherein some of them were actually killed and massacred because they told people one simple thing: believe in God and believe in them as a prophet. And people didn't like that. So again, we learned something very critical, that tests are a reality and tests will take place, especially if we wish to continue to be faith holders. As the Quran says, when God doesn't love a person, then God gives that person everything in this world. When God does not love, when a person forgets God, let me say it better. When a person gives up or forgets God, let's put it that way. When a person forgets God, then God opens the doors of partying and having all the merrymaking they can do and having all this great fun. And then God, what he says thereafter, حتى إذا فرحوا بما أوتوا أخذناهم بغتة فإذا هم مبلسون. And just when they start partying and enjoying life, God pulls the rug from them. And then they realize, what happened? How come I lost all this? How come my partner doesn't want to be with me anymore? How come I have economic loss? How come I have political loss? Yes, you have it because you did not turn to God, and God let you just run crazy and do whatever you want to do. Therefore, the third lesson we take, if we don't have tests, then it means to us as believers that maybe I'm doing something wrong. And if you are going through challenges, it means God loves you and he wants to make you much more stronger. There's a beautiful saying that our children have out there, and some of you know it. What doesn't kill you makes you. Yes, you got it. And the same thing applies to faith as well. So anyway, I covered these 3 points, and I hope that somehow it brings understanding for anyone that is going through pain, that realize full well that whatever challenges you are going through or have seen others going through, let's look at it as a form of blessing. One final point I may give. There was a fellow that was complaining, and we've heard this example in many different forms, complaining that I'm late for work. My boss is going to yell at me. And as he's going for work, he realizes just in front of him, there's an accident, there's a fire, there is this and there is that. In the beginning, he looked at it as, wow, I'm late, it's the end of the world. Only later to realize that little punishment he'll get at work, or she'll get at work, is far more better than the destruction that is going to take place in as far as an accident is concerned. So therefore, many times as I conclude, all our challenges that we are going through, in reality, it is a blessing in disguise. Poverty, we look at poverty as an evil thing, but ask many people, it sometimes becomes a blessing in disguise. Ask a man or a woman that's wealthy, the challenges that they go through, bodyguards and whatnot, lawsuits and whatnot. But yet the one that is poor, what they say, why does God do this to me? We have to embrace the challenges God has given us. And when we do it and we show patience, God opens many doors. Again, thank you all for giving me an opportunity to share a few words. It has been wonderful doing this presentation, and I look forward to hearing our other folks as well. Thank you again kindly. God bless. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Imam Mehtar. So I heard 3 things. Number 1, to promote reform, to bring us to God. Number 2, suffering occurs to challenge us to greatness. And number 3, the greatest test is for the greatest believer. So thank you very much for sharing those. And our next speaking from
I think I should have given that speech to you, and you could have just given us 3 points and saved us all the time.
No, you did a wonderful job, Imam. Thank you so much. Speaking from within the Quaker tradition, our next panelist is Karsten Van Sander. Chaplain Van Sander has been a healthcare chaplain since 2014, working for several years at the UCLA Medical Center and Little Company of Mary Medical Center in Torrance, mostly on ICU and oncology. He also worked closely with bioethics committees at both hospitals, both advocating for patients with the medical staff and supporting families when further aggressive care was deemed futile. Karsten studied theology and philosophy at Bonn University in Germany, Oxford University in the UK, and Princeton Theological Seminary in the United States. He worked for 2 years with the Three Faiths Forum in London, developing educational materials for young people engaged in dialogue between the Abrahamic faith traditions. Growing up in Germany, he began his own spiritual journey as a Lutheran, later found a home in the United Methodist Church, and has for many years been a Quaker. Karsten Van Sander, thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to hearing your understanding of suffering in light of a loving God.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I was I was a little taken aback at the beginning when you said, "Oh, we're talking about theodicy," because I had taken the whole topic I took a little different angle in it, but I think that's okay because I think that is somewhat telling of my own Quaker perspective, and I hope they'll become clear. Yeah, you mentioned we all wear different hats, and I wear, well, right now I'm wearing the one of a Quaker, and I'm also a healthcare chaplain. And at some point I worked in an interfaith environment, and we would always talk to the students and tell them, speak from your heart, be honest, and speak as yourself. So don't just say all Episcopalians believe, but I as a whatever your faith tradition might be. And so I'm going to try to do that as well, and speak as a Quaker, not as the Quakers or on behalf of Quakerism. And I think that's always a good idea, I think, for most faith traditions, but especially for Quakers, that holds true simply because we don't have a creed or a dogma. There is a religious body called the Society of Friends, but what holds us together is not a faith or a set of beliefs, but shared practices and core values. And most Quakers that you would ask will tell you that those values are peace, our simplicity, our community, and equality. And there might be a couple of other ones, and there are other lists out there, and that tells you something right away about Quakers, and that we don't agree on anything. So this is not a canonical list that I'm giving you, but this is something I think that most people, that goes back to George Fox, our founder, and that most Quakers would agree on. And so I'm going to try to speak about suffering, sort of in light of these testimonies, as they're sometimes called by Quakers. Also important, I think, is that Quakers believe that the divine, that God, is speaking to us in the form of an inner light. That all of us have an inner light that somehow we can access, and that is sort of a way of connecting with God and God's revelation. And then there's also sort of a core, sort of a saying that's often quoted in Quaker circles that goes back to George Fox again. And he said, "Walk cheerfully over the earth, answering to that of God in everyone." So we believe not just that we have an inner light, but there's that of God. That's sort of the phrase that's often used. There's something of God in everyone. And that guides usually, or should guide, I should say, the interpretation of these four values. Let me say a little bit about peace. Quakers are traditionally, or have traditionally, opposed war, and have been as one of the pacifist religions, as are, for example, the Methodists and others. The Amish are, but Quakers are one of those that have come out very strongly against war from day one, and have sort of early on talked about the military-industrial complex and how that does not quite fit with their faith, certainly not with faith in the Jesus that we find in Scripture, but not with how Quakers understood their own belief in Jesus. And I don't want to get too political here. I know this is, especially in America, is a very divisive issue, but for Quakers, peace is important in the context of suffering too, because a lot of our suffering in our world is what we do to one another. And you can extend that even and say that war takes many forms. There are wars like the one we're right now in the Ukraine, but there are also wars on the poor. There is a war on the marginalized, and that of God for a Quaker should not be diminished in anybody. And so peace is a guiding principle when it comes to suffering, especially when suffering is understood sort of in a large structural and systemic way. Of course, suffering is especially as a chaplain, I know that suffering is often a very personal, sometimes subjective issue, and especially it is sort of a part of just being human. It's we get sick, we know we feel pain, we experience loss, we lose people we love. And so as a chaplain, I certainly, as at the beginning when I started out in this line of work, I always felt the need to say something and to get into what you mentioned, theodicy, and try to defend God. And what my faith has sort of taught me over time was to just be silent. Quakers, as many of you might know, we worship in silence. We believe that God speaks to us in that silence, and we sit in community listening to God and receiving, hoping to receive sort of little bits of that truth, that bigger truth that is God. And so sitting with people in suffering, I try not to jump to listen to my own impulse and my own temptation to say something too quickly about why God would do this, or why a person gotten sick or whatever it may be. And again, Quakers have this tradition to sit in silence, to listen to God speak, and occasionally somebody might get up and say something, and the understandings that they're being led by the Holy Spirit, by their inner light, to say something maybe about the events of the day or whatever it may be. Sometimes people share a poem, sometimes people share from the Christian scriptures. It depends. But it is understood that when that occurs, and on a given Sunday morning when we meet, we usually sit for 60 minutes. That might happen once or twice. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all, so it's not very frequent. But when it does, it is the understanding in the community that you just listen to what's being said and don't respond to it immediately, but honor it by giving it some space. And there's this funny phrase where we say that friend, that other Quaker, in other words, speaks my mind. That's sort of the least, that's the maximum you're basically allowed to say, and that's the way of saying I agree with what's just being said. But it's important to just allow for space for what was just sort of what another person experienced as God speaking to them and what they wanted to share. And that respect for the other person and what they're sharing, I try to bring that to when I talk to my practice as a chaplain, when I witness a lot of real suffering, real struggle, and I try to not jump in there, but really receive it and hear it, and ultimately I will respond, and I have things to say. It's not that I just sit there silently, but I try to create space around what I just received. And ultimately, I would say that is sort of a reflection of this Quaker idea that God is a mystery, and that we don't do God justice by but being overly descriptive, overly grasping for something that is bigger than our grasp, really. And so, yeah, I try to do that in my practice as well. Yeah, I hope I hope I did the topic justice tonight. I might share a few words. Sort of, I prepared a little bit, but now I'm going off the cuff a little bit. I said I'm one Quaker, and my personal theology, if you want to call it that, is what you might call process theology. And so, Tim, I think you studied at Claremont, so you that's sort of ground zero for a lot of process theology, of course. So I'm sure you're very familiar with it. But if for the other people listening, and if you don't know, process theology is the idea that God is still in the becoming, in the making, if you like, and that God is not just there in and of God's self and then creates a world, but that God is part of this ever becoming of the world, and that God is therefore not necessarily omnipotent and doing these things to us, but that God is with us in our suffering, that God is part of the experience, including the experience of suffering that we have as human beings in the world. And so that is something that I personally, I'm human, of course, too. That gives me strength, and I try to bring that into my practice as a chaplain too. And I might say, for example, I don't know why these things are happening, but I do know that God is with you right now. That God can be found in the midst of this very, very difficult experience. Yeah, and I think I'm gonna leave it at that. But I'd like to hear your questions.
Thank you, Karsten. That's there's so much value in the notion of just sitting with somebody in suffering. And I remember Rabbi Lotker saying that academic explanations of theology, of theodicy, really have no business in the hospital. And so I appreciate those remarks, Karsten. Our final speaker tonight comes from the Baha'i tradition. Katia Arami is a Baha'i from Thousand Oaks and a graduate of UCLA with degrees in economics and international development. Katia currently writes a series for the publication of BahaiTeachings.org on how we can build a better economy by applying spiritual principles to economic life. She also actively participates in and organizes Baha'i events among the Los Angeles youth. Katia, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I wanted to start off by saying that it's such a pleasure to be here with you all, people of all different faith backgrounds, and hear your perspectives. So I'm going to speak a lot to that actually as I go through this presentation. But let me go ahead and share my screen first of all, and also move that out of the way so I can see you guys. All right, so kind of as what you've heard from other speakers, I am just an average Baha'i. I'm not a religious scholar as others are actually, and nor am I a member of the clergy. But in preparing for this presentation, I have really pulled from the Baha'i writings so I can best represent what Baha'is believe. And obviously a lot of this, it's a little bit of my interpretation, right, as I read the writings. But by including a lot of the quotes here, I hope that it allows room for your understanding as well. And I wanted to start by recalling the last discussion that we had on this topic. And we heard from the perspectives of Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and specifically the Episcopal Church. And I remember that as I was sitting and listening to the different speakers, and I took the chance to take some notes as well, what really struck me is that absolutely every point that was said by a different speaker was something that resonated for me as a Baha'i, and that made complete sense. And later, as I began to do research, I could find quotes to support it. So you're going to see that, as I go through the presentation, you're going to hear a repetition of some of these ideas. And later at the end, I'm going to do a bit of reflection on what's the relationship between the Baha'i perspective and the perspectives we've heard thus far. And I will say, I mean, I think that's the purpose of these meetings, right? Is to see this really beautiful harmony between these different religions. So before I go into the Baha'i perspective, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the faith, just in case it would be helpful to those present. So the Baha'i faith was founded in 1863 by the prophet founder Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of God. And one of the most significant teachings of the Baha'i faith is that of progressive revelation, which tells us that all these different religions are really just one religion unfolding over time from one God, bringing us messages over time, and that the core teachings of all these faiths, or one faith, if you see it as a Baha'i, are the same, but the social teachings update over time. So for Baha'is, Baha'u'llah is considered the most recent messenger of God, and he brought a message of the oneness of humanity, and that is the biggest principle in the Baha'i faith, as well as the elimination of prejudice. That includes racial prejudice, religious prejudice, and other kinds of prejudice, the equality of men and women, the harmony of science and religion, the elimination of economic extremes. And these are just some principles for Baha'is. That's a very brief snippet of what the Baha'i faith is. And now I want to address our topic for tonight. So I think it was Rabbi Locker who broke this topic down into two different sections. One is that suffering, one element of it is calamity, which I use this word here because you see it come up time and again in the Baha'i writings. And to me, calamity is inexplicable suffering, like illness or natural disasters that you cannot rationally reason why it's happening. And the other is suffering that comes about through free will, or if you want to call it the existence of evil in this world. So I'm going to start by talking about the former, and then later I'll talk about the latter part of this with the element of free will. So calamity is such a difficult topic to talk about because it is and will likely always remain a mystery for us. So all we can really do as people of faith is pull from the writings and read about this topic and try and understand how do we grapple with it. So I pulled from the Baha'i writings for this, and the first quote I took out is a quote from Baha'u'llah that says, "O son of man, my calamity is my providence. Outwardly it is fire and vengeance, but inwardly it is light and mercy." And then it tells us to hasten thereunto, to run towards it so that we can become an eternal light and an immortal spirit. So there's so much that's interesting in this quote. This idea that calamity is kind of providence. And when you look up the word providence, providence is care or foresight for us. So God, somehow this suffering is God's foresight for us, or God looking out for us. And in another element, light, something that illumines, is something that allows us to see, to develop our understanding, right? And then finally, this idea of suffering as a form of God's mercy. And I think this next quote helps us understand this a little bit better. This quote is specifically about prayers said for the healing of illness. And it tells us that if healing is right for the patient, it will be granted. But for some ailing persons, healing would only be the cause of other ills, and therefore wisdom does not permit an affirmative answer to this. So how do we understand this in the context of mercy? And also the quote and the word here, wisdom, which is used. It suggests that possibly when suffering occurs, there is a reason that we cannot understand. Maybe that person would have gone through worse suffering, or there's some kind of God's mercy or God's wisdom that we cannot grasp here. But I also wanted to talk about this idea of tests, and we actually heard this from Imam Mehtar earlier, right? This idea that suffering can serve as a way for us to grow. So I think if you speak to Baha'is and you ask them about suffering, I think the most common answer you will get is that suffering comes in the form of tests so that we can grow spiritually. So for Baha'is, Our purpose on this earth is to grow spiritually. And this doesn't happen in isolation. It happens through service to humanity, through constantly working for the betterment of the world, daily acting on our faith and our beliefs. So the writings tell us that the mind and spirit of man advance when he is tried by suffering, and that through suffering, he will attain to an eternal happiness which nothing can take from him. So as a Baha'i, there is actually prayers for tests, which are not prayers to get assistance with tests, but are actually asking God for tests so that you can grow from them. And to expand on this, there's another quote where Baha'u'llah says that God hath never burdened any soul beyond its power. So while these tests may come to us and allow for us to grow, it's never beyond our capacity. So to some, this might seem a bit dissatisfying, that we have to rely on the idea that God is all merciful, that there is a wisdom in it. And I think to me, this is where the element of faith comes in. And I think that's what makes someone a person of faith. So I included my favorite prayer that to me is a prayer about faith, and I just wanted to read it. Remember at all times and in all places that God is faithful, and do not doubt this. Be patient, even though calamities may come upon thee. Yet fear not. Be firm in the path of thy Lord, as a mountain unmoved, unchanging in thy steadfastness. So if we take this perspective on suffering, does it mean that we should be apathetic? Because it's good for us, because it's through God's mercy, we should not acknowledge suffering in the world and we should allow it to happen? Absolutely not, because the other side of this equation is human free will that allows for suffering in the world. So this quote says that, and this is a quote from Baha'u'llah again, I've brought forth and revealed unto you the pearls that lay concealed in the depths of his everlasting ocean. Who else but yourselves is to be blamed if ye choose to remain unendowed with so great an outpouring of God's transcendent and all-encompassing grace? All to emphasize that humans have an element of free will. But how do we understand God's element in this? And how is there any possibility for acting on that free will in a way that will not bring about suffering in the world? As Baha'is, we're told that the prophets of God should be regarded as physicians whose task is to foster the well-being of the world and its peoples, that through the spirit of oneness, they may heal the sickness of a divided humanity. So it's so interesting to think about this idea of the prophets of God as divine physicians, that they send us a remedy and that humans have to act on it to eliminate suffering in this world. And what's so emphasized in this quote is exactly the spirit of oneness or unity, which is the foremost principle in the Baha'i faith. We're further told that the prophets of God have been sent, the holy books have been written, so that man may be made free. And how is man made free? Or as it says here, born into the world of the spirit? It is through divine education. And this divine or spiritual education is through the holy writings. So we're even told that evil in this world can be described as this state of imperfection, and that through education, and of course this is divine education, we must free ourselves, and we can free ourselves from these imperfections. So this is the human element, right? That God is sending us these divine messengers, that as God is sending us teachings that will allow us to free ourselves from evil and eliminate suffering in the world. So suddenly this gives us purpose, right? That the well-being of mankind, we're told, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And what does this imply? That humanity itself can establish unity in the world. And through establishing unity, we can eliminate suffering. So for Baha'is, this is our ultimate purpose, is to establish unity in the world. And this is what we're constantly acting on. And this is what I think defines a lot of the way Baha'is will live their lives. But I want to be concrete about this too. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because this sounds so high level, establishing unity in the world. What does that mean? For Baha'is, I think it primarily means three things. And that we can establish unity through, first and foremost, spiritual education or divine education, which is rooted in the teachings of those divine messengers. And actually, spiritual education in the Baha'i community, there are systematic programs for this taking place throughout the world. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because I think it's a separate subject. Baha'is are actively working towards spiritual education for the world. Also building community, which is a huge element of those programs that I'm talking about. So these are really large elements of how Baha'is act towards building unity in this world. And then finally, acting in accordance with the teachings of God. I think this resonates for all people of faith as well. So let's look back at, again, what we talked about in the last discussion on this topic. And obviously, I couldn't include the other faiths here, the Quaker perspective and the Muslim perspective, but I think even those have a lot of resonance here. So I'm going to start by talking about what Rabbi Locker spoke about from the perspective of Judaism, that God does not interfere in nature. And from a Baha'i perspective, we talked about the element of free will, right? That God gives us a choice whether to act in accordance with his teachings or not. Then it was mentioned that God is a teacher or inspirer. And again, we had this term divine educators that Baha'is speak about. And then Rabbi Locker discussed that humanity is reaching an age of maturity, like a growing child, and that God's messages transform over time. And he spoke about this in the context of the Hebrew Bible, first saying, the way Deuteronomy teaches us these lessons is different from the book of Job, which is different from the rest of the Hebrew Bible. But from a Baha'i perspective, this is also different from each prophet, that the way these teachings are presented to us, I think you can say evolve over time, but remain the same at their core. And then finally, that we're a part of God's creation process in perfecting it. And absolutely, I mean, we talked about the action element of this, that we have free will and that we can act to eliminate suffering in this world. And then also from the perspective of Buddhism, that compassion, community, and contentment, which to me is, contentment means not being materialistic, but rather living a spiritual existence, that these can relieve suffering. And that first and foremost, understanding oneness and establishing unity, as a Baha'i would say, eliminate suffering in this world. And also the other points here, you'll notice, I could support these also from a Baha'i perspective, but I didn't want to get off track and speak about other points. But even from the perspective of Islam, this idea of tests that are for our growth, absolutely, we spoke about that. So I think there's so much resonance here, and I think that's beautiful to see. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak from a Baha'i perspective, and share the Baha'i view, which is so much in harmony with that of other faiths. So thank you again.
What a wonderful conclusion to point out the similarities between the faiths. And I noted, just as you were speaking, I didn't note them all, but I noted the inwardly calamity is a light and a mercy, a way of causing us to grow spiritually. So that sort of tracks with the imam's challenge to greatness. I noted the purpose, and I thought before you even mentioned it, that of the Jewish notion that we're completing the creation of the universe, and what a purpose that gives to people's lives. And then I noted your corresponding with the Buddhist idea of building community. So thank you so much, Katya. And now I want to open it. And before we open it for the Q&A session, I want to give Karsten and Katya and the imam a chance to interact with each other just for a couple of minutes and ask questions of each other. And then we'll open it to the wider audience for Q&A.
Okay, I was going to ask you, did you want to do the survey first?
Sure, I'll put that in the, I'll put that in the, it's there now,
The interfering why?
in the chat. But yeah, Katya and Imam and Carson, let's let you guys have the first crack at each other before we open it to the wider community. Don't everybody speak at once.
Mm.
I told you we sit in silence a lot, so that's my out right now.
I so appreciated that, Karsten. Again, having pastored myself many, many years ago, I know what it is to sit in silence with somebody who's suffering. And sometimes there's just no good thing to say to them. So I really valued that addition.
No questions of each other?
The fact that we are able to talk about this, number one, and number two is the similarities that have been presented. And if I may ask the other main speakers, if I can, where do you see a problem with the things that we are presenting forth towards the public? Because at the end of the day, we are spiritual. We may understand all these things. That's fine. That's in its place. But we are not here as an elite group just for ourselves. So my question is, how do we share this message to others out there that creates greater understanding and awareness that there is more to conflict than just conflict. There is more to strife than just strife. There is more to starvation than just starvation. At the same time, not passing the message that, yes, starvation is a good thing. How do you, and many of you are much younger than me, so I think you can do a better job in sharing, how can I share this with the youth?
Karsten or Katya, you want to field that?
Yeah, what I would say, again, I feel like I'm speaking too much from my own perspective, so I don't want to just monopolize that. But I think what came up in both of your presentations, and I maybe should have said more myself about, is that there's a lot of unnecessary suffering in our society that I don't want to trivialize it, but you might call it unnecessary drama sometimes, right? I mean, we cause a lot of our suffering, not all of it. Again, I want to tread lightly here, but there's a lot of drama, and I think young people in particular are often more in danger, if you like, of being drawn into it. But at the same time, everything that I'm hearing, and I'm in my 40s, so I'm certainly not young, but I hear a lot about younger people that makes me very hopeful that they also have a very good sense of have an ability to bypass some of that drama, and not all of them, right? But that there's sort of a certain radar that says I don't need to engage with this, and I don't need to burden myself with certain expectations, and I find that very hopeful, actually. So I don't know if that's a good answer.
That's a good point. You brought about self-inflicted drama, self-inflicted pain versus that which happens through natural disasters. And I think we have to make a distinction between the both. It's a very good point you have made. Yeah, I think Sister Katya probably has a point. Yeah.
I did also want to address your question, and just from my perspective, in terms of what I see as the struggle, especially among my friends, and maybe what helps me stay hopeful in the world with so much suffering around us. I think when you take a perspective that doesn't look at the spiritual understanding of the world, it can seem chaotic and random and inexplicable and unsolvable. And like we have no power or agency to change things, especially when the very systems in our society are broken. So when you take a spiritual perspective and you begin to understand that the root cause of these is disunity and ignorance and greed, materialism, and you begin to understand the spiritual reality around us and how that is creating so much challenges in our society and so much suffering. For me, I begin to feel hopeful. And I'm very fortunate that, I mentioned these Baha'i programs for spiritual education. And I really that is a spark of hope for me that, society can fundamentally change. And there is a possibility if we come together through unity. Sorry, that's my timer. And we truly live in accordance with trying to act on unity and equality every day, we can bring about a society free from suffering. And of course, I think some people might find that idealistic, but that is what gives me hope, at least in my life, is taking a spiritual perspective.
Terry, you want to go ahead, Imam?
I see that that's a very, very good point, and that's a very, I think, deeper and philosophical way that she has presented it, giving us all much more to reflect upon. So I cannot thank both of them for that, of course.
Terry,
yeah.
do you want to open it? You're muted, Terry.
I can open it if they're ready, if there are two questions with each other. I do want to, before, and I want to affirm that I jumped too quickly. So, okay. So, Vita, Fafa had put in the chat something that I thought was very interesting, and it's not a question, it's a statement. The presentations tonight remind me of the following quote from the ancient Greek playwright. I can't say this. Baba, do you want to say it?
I have. Oh, I'm sorry, Terry. I'm just gonna take a stab. Aeschylus.
Yeah, I thought, I was hoping. Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And this was a favorite quote of Robert Kennedy. And the whole thing, even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom. And I think that's I have never heard that quote, and I really appreciate you sharing it, Baba. And the idea that whether it's the pain that we endure because we're suffering from physical, emotional, spiritual pain brought on ourselves, or because our loved ones are suffering, or because we have done pain to somebody and we feel that guilt, I think that's a tremendous statement in any of those ways. And I don't know about anybody else, but when I have done something against my brother or sister, Christian or of another faith, I am not comfortable until I have made it right. And you can't, it goes deeper within the sleep because you're working it out and you find a way to answer that. So thank you for sharing that. And as you were speaking, Imam, and I forgot how to say your name, Katya? I noticed that you were talking about peace and unity. So one of my questions that came up is, how do the current events reflect on unity and peace? And this includes Karsten, because you were speaking of peace. And you did bring up the war in Ukraine, but the current events, and it's not just Ukraine, it's what's in our own country, it's what's going on in South Sudan, and I could go on and list many things. In Palestine and diseases and whatnot. How do we reconcile that? Looking for, and as you said, Katya, we're progressing and growing in that. And I believe, Karsten, you said that too, we're progressing, but it doesn't feel like progression. How do we answer that?
if I may, is that Katya? I
please.
really liked what you said earlier about taking a spiritual perspective on things, and for me, in part, that's taking a very long view, one that's potentially longer than my own lifetime, and that's a belief in God's providence, basically, that is painfully slow sometimes, right? When we look at global warming, we look at the ice caps melting, right? And we wish something would happen very, very quickly, and it might not, right? But there is for me, there is a belief in God playing a very long game toward the good, toward perfection, and that's where I draw hope from.
Conflict.
That's not easy to sit with, it's very, very not very satisfying at all, and I have to really remind myself over and over of that.
There's another dimension that I look at, and much of the issues that we're talking about, Ukraine, or even sometimes within our own country, and you also made a point before that really struck very good with me. We have to decipher between what is human-made calamities and God-driven calamities. God-driven calamities, I notice we always, for example, God forbid there's an earthquake right now. There will be enough compassion in every aspect of humanity that will say, let's help these people out. Because when God puts a calamity forward, God also presents a solution with it. Right now, and America, by the way, has been very generous. Whenever we see videos of people suffering abroad, whether it's Ethiopia or whatnot, Americans send tons of money over to make it easy for them. Because as humans, we can decipher between, and we distinguish between a human-made calamity that has economics behind it and a political motivation behind it versus a calamity that is beyond our control. And I think once we are able to know the separation between the both, the one that is on the corrupt side, meaning wars, etc. I'll give you a simple example regarding the Palestinian issue and the Israeli issue. I am from South Africa, as you know. And if you tell me right now, why do the blacks hate you, Mohammed? If you tell me that, I'll say, I know exactly why they hate me. Because I did not stand up for justice when I was a child, so I couldn't have done much. But there should be a remorse within me that says, why didn't myself and people around me do enough to break down apartheid? So we have to distinguish between tsunamis, earthquakes, and tragedies that happen as a result of, naturalness, so to speak, versus that which is made out there by individuals for a political motivation and agenda. And then the third point regarding this is, and the ones that are doing it, like for example, South Africa, where we had apartheid, blacks go there, whites go on top, blacks go at the bottom, blacks are savages, the way they are presented as, and whites or anything of a lighter shade are considered more superior. Well, when we see things that we have to say, I'm sorry, politics aside, this is a human issue, and let's deal with it from a humanitarian perspective. If I in America have the right to have 3 meals, etc., 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 I don't care for your politics, and I want to give you that dignity. And if we unite on that, as Sister Katya has brought forth, then I think we can go a very, very long way.
I think what Chaplain Van Sanders said about how, as spiritual people, you take the long view is so true. And it's not satisfying to everyone. But we also know that that is the only way that we can solve, in the long term, suffering in our world. Our political system can't do it. Charity can't do it. We have to take, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you want to look at it that way, the long perspective. But something I think that's an interesting element of the Baha'i faith and the way Baha'is view suffering in the world today is there's this idea of disintegrative and integrative forces, that while the world is experiencing suffering and is becoming more and more, suffering is presenting itself in terms of society in America is divided in a way it's never been before. we're seeing the situation become worse and worse and more hopeless. We're experiencing the pandemic that the imam mentioned, that pandemics in the past, at least, people could unify in a way and to say that we need to look out for one another to eliminate this. But now we can't even agree on things like, getting vaccines to take care of one another. We're seeing society progress in that way, and disintegrating, if you want to use that term. But at the same time, we should remain hopeful because unity is building and people are coming to the realization that this is unsustainable, that we need to come together, that when you see the pandemic and what the result was, well, what if we could have had open communication to warn other countries before it got there? What if we could have shared information across lines? What if we could have come together to look out for one another? I think, these, from a Baha'i perspective, these forces are happening at the same time. While it seems hopeless, at the same time, unity is building. People are coming together and they're recognizing this need. So I think, just to add a little bit, that would be the Baha'i perspective and why we should remain hopeful at the same time.
So that's interesting, Katya, that you spoke to that, because one of the questions that I got was from some people who prefaced it with talking about humanity is free to itself. If humanity is free to free itself from evil, it must first achieve unity. To me, this comports with Jesus's command that we love others as ourselves. That means all of humanity. But humanity, especially when looked at collectively, has never remotely approached this ideal. We remain in a fallen state, especially collectively as tribes or nations. And they ask, isn't this a prescription for pessimism instead of optimism?
I thought it was really interesting what Katya said about the integrative forces. And Karsten, this may resonate with you. One of the things that they insisted on at Claremont School of Theology with regards to process theology was the divine lure towards towards the good. And for Christians, that would probably be the Holy Spirit. But this notion that there is God is pulling people towards the good, I think really resonates with that. Would you say, Imam, that there's such a concept in Islam that there's something of God in humanity that is pulling humanity towards the good?
Every situation that we are tested with, if an individual looks deeper in it, there's always going to be good in it, because God himself says that my mercy overpowers my anger. So if God's mercy overpowers his anger, then the suffering that we are seeing out there, what is it for? There has to be a purpose. And the only way we can know its purpose is that if humanity realizes, as the Quran says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. We created various creatures and humans so they may worship God. Number one, what's the definition of worship? The definition of worship is being cognizant of your creator in every situation. Number three, if you are cognizant of your creator in every situation, then any test that you're going through, if you know it is from God, then it is not as much of a challenge as one may think it to be. Because many of our challenges are all in our head, more than the challenge that is really out there. Because God, and I think this was brought up earlier by our guest speakers as well, where God says, "La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha." I will never test a soul. God says, I will not test a soul beyond what a soul can overcome. I will not test a soul beyond what a soul can endure. Having said that, there's a very beautiful point that has been made here by, I see, Irshad and Shanaz Ali, where they quote a part of the Quran that basically states, and I'll just give a summary version, that where God says, I will test you with something of fear. Who has not been through fear and anxiety? I will test you with hunger. Those that fast, they go through it. I will test you with loss of wealth. COVID, we know people are working the same hours as they may have worked pre-COVID. However, because of inflation, so let's say you're making 100,000 before COVID. Well, maybe you got a salary increase to 110. Okay, you got a 10% increase. but the amount of we are dealing with inflation is far more greater than that, especially with the consequences. So we are going through loss of wealth. We are going through loss of soul. Everyone knows someone who has died or the other. When it says fruits over here, it's referring to the benefits of life. So the point here is each one of us are going to go through it, but the best of the ones that are going through all these challenges are the ones that can endure patiently and say, God, I know it is coming my way to make me a better person. If that's not what we take with us, then every challenge, I'm afraid, is not a challenge, but an outright disaster, which will torment us not only in this world, we believe as Muslims, but possibly in the hereafter, which we ask God to prevent each one of us from attaining. So I don't know if that clarifies any of what you have brought forth.
Thank you.
Well, and that leads to the question that they asked right above that, Imam. If life did not have a struggle, there would be no purpose here. Otherwise, we would be in infelicity, and everything would be pleasant. And why would we have a reason to grow?
Before I hand it over to the other guests, I don't want to hog the time here. The purpose of life is not struggle. The purpose of life is to follow what God wants us to do. If we follow what God wants us to do, then in reality, even if there is a struggle, the struggle is a joy because God wanted me to do it, right? Overtime is not people getting paid overtime is not a problem for them. Why? Because they know the benefits outweigh the consequences or the negatives. So that some people actually wait for overtime. Imagine now staying at your job after 8 hours. Your feet are hurting, everything is tired, but you enjoy it. Why? Because you know there is something great coming. Likewise, if you look at challenges coming your way as from God, because you didn't do anything to influence that challenge, then you know as a believer that God now is giving you a greater reward, which is going to be waiting in store for you when we meet with God. So I would beg to differ a little bit with that question, because if we look at life as a struggle, then that makes life a very, very sad place. That means now I'm just looking for the next struggle to get a bigger paradise. And our religion believes if there are two pathways, an easy one or a challenging one, take the easier one over the challenging one. So we don't wait for struggles, but if it comes, we're not there to embrace it as, wow, thank you for coming. But at the same time, we are willing to say, God, you have sent it my way. And I know if I go through and I manage this, that is going to be great for me. And the greatness of the hereafter and the award overpowers the challenges that I'm going through in as far as the cost and reward ratio. Katia and Carsten, if you'll wish, I can please add on to that at any point.
Please.
I'm looking at my wife, who's also here, and I see her sort of. I imagine she's getting nervous. I'm hearing that, but she's a trauma therapist, and so I would say there's struggle that makes us grow. Just like sort of going to the gym helps us. There's resistance and our muscles grow, right? That's sort of that analogy. But there's also struggle that holds us down and that can even destroy a person or can stunt them awfully. And so I that's why I'm somewhat reluctant to say there's a struggle is there's a point to struggle. But I find in my own practice too, as a chaplain who works a lot at the end of life, that often the very end of life gives life meaning, right? It is the fact that we know we have to let go ultimately, and we know that our time is limited, that hopefully makes us turn around and reconcile with people that we if we had an attorney in front of us, I could just hold that grudge forever anyway, right? Because it wouldn't matter. But the fact that we do have a finite amount of time here on this earth gives meaning to those years, to that time that we do have. And so in that sense, I very much agree with what you said, Irshad and Shanaz.
Gotcha.
I also, I'm happy to address the question. So the question is really asking, right, if we were able to live lives without any struggle, like what would be our purpose? Could we even have happiness? And actually, there are quotes in the Bahá'í writings that address this directly. But I think one way to think of it is, while we can wipe out suffering, and I'm not going to go into more on that here because I feel like I touched on it in the presentation. We can never fully eliminate suffering in this world. And why is that? As people of faith, we know we are spiritual beings. We are souls living in a material world. To start off, I mean, that concept entirely suggests that how can we be happy in a world which is material and where there's so many veils in front of us? And even when we have faith, our faith develops over time. Even though I was born into a Bahá'í family, that does not mean that because I had these writings accessible to me from a young age and I was raised with it, I have been living a perfect life devoid of any struggle. No, because what I've been through in life is what has developed my faith over time. So I think it's a simple answer, but I think it addresses the question. As spiritual beings in a material world, we cannot live a life without struggle. And in fact, we need that struggle in order to develop our faith. And even to refer back to that quote, right? It said that through suffering, man will attain eternal happiness.
So next question, and it's on the same path. Many Christians abandon their faith when they face suffering. Does that happen amongst Muslims, Baha'is, and Quakers?
Well, since nobody's going, there's one reality. Many individuals that give up on faith sometimes give up on faith because faith holders themselves are not the greatest examples of faith. That's what I have noticed. People that give up on faith, for example, if my child says tomorrow, I don't want to be a Muslim, it's not because my child doesn't want to be spiritual. My child didn't have a good model, role model in their father when they were growing up. That when their father would go through struggles, for example, let's say I go through challenges, I come home, I get angry, I get violent. My child begins to say, what's wrong with this guy? He's quote unquote an imam. He tells people to do good. He talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. So when people leave the faith, and many Christians, for example, and many people are different, even Muslims, when they leave the faith, they're not leaving the faith because they don't like the faith. They are leaving the faith because of negatives they have seen within Muslims and the community itself and the poor examples, number one. And the poor examples, number two, are generally from those individuals that are closest to them, whether it's the imams or the parents or families, etc. So I think if imams, religious people, people like you and I, and our families put our act right, when these people are going through trauma, whatever it may be they're going through. And again, Cousin brought up some very good points when he mentioned, regarding sufferings people go through. The thing here is, when we go through suffering, and if we can reach out to our loved ones without fear, without fearing that if I reach out to my religious leader, he's going to exploit it. He's going to talk about it in the next sermon. He's going to do this or she's going to do that, etc. If they feel safe, then yes, they will go through that turbulent point in life. But immediately, when they know they can go to a safe place, it can resolve that matter of minimizing people leaving the faith. And again, people leave the faith for many other reasons as well. Many people leave the faith because it doesn't jive with their politics. It doesn't jive with the economics. To be a Muslim, I'll be very honest to say, economically, it sometimes brings you down. If you're going to wear, like women, certain Muslim women, they wear certain attire. Certain men want to hold on to certain attire. That in the business world, doesn't make for good economics at times. And that creates unnecessary stress upon the children. And sometimes people, quote unquote, strategically depart. The reasons are many, but I think it's the first one where faith holders are not doing justice to the faith, which results in them presenting the greatest examples. Young ones don't know how to work with that later on. And eventually they say, I've had enough because you talk the talk, you don't walk the walk, and it's better that I walk away from your talk.
Thank you, Imam. Karsten or Katya?
I can give kind of a brief and succinct response, which is firstly that I don't think it matters what religion it is. faith is an element that is, I think, to me, it is not necessarily directly related to the doctrine. If you're suffering in life, if every faith, every religion has the same core beliefs, then there's no religion that is going to prevent that from happening. So I think it would be foolish of me to sit here and say that that does not happen. Of course it does. But I think what Imam Mehtar said about the individuals around you is so important. And to me, that is the topic of community. That there's two things that I think give us strength in times when our faith is tested. And one to me is community, and the other to me is prayer. So yeah, that's the only simple answer I can give, is that of course faith goes across religious lines, and that prayer and community are what give us strength in those times.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree very much with that too. Again, speaking from my own perspective, I felt I had a time of walking away from faith, and I found in the Quaker tradition sort of a home or a safe haven. That said, sort of demographically, Quakers are not growing. We're a very small community. But I know that the many of my Quaker friends often have had a journey where they walked away from, were very disillusioned with whatever faith tradition they had, and found it very, very helpful or healing to be in the silence and sit with the mystery of God, when a very prescriptive view of God was often quite hurtful to them in their past. So that's my own personal experience.
So we're about 8:25, and I will speak to that. I'm going to speak my own personal statement there, Karsten. And that is, in my own suffering in the past, my pain would drive me to my God and bring a deeper relationship. So I think often that's what happens, is we find solace in God. We grow through that, just as has been said tonight. That's my personal belief. That is not necessarily for everybody else. So saying that, are there any questions that have not been presented that anybody feels they would like to ask at this time? You can unmute yourself and ask it. Okay. Okay, saying that, I would like to say that we will be meeting on September 27th via Zoom, and we will be focusing on one type of religion, faith, denomination, whichever you want to call that. It will be on Pentecostalism, and Tim Helton will be presenting on that, and he has personal knowledge and he has studied it to a large extent. So I think you will find that very interesting, and you can come with your questions. And I'm hoping that Rabbi Mike will come and present some questions on that. That's always fun. And also that in October, we will not be having any Zoom meetings, but we will be having, I feel like trumpets should be playing right now. We should be having the Feast of Faiths. We have not had the Feast of Faith since 2019, before the pandemic. And we will be hosting, the St. Columba's Episcopal Church will be hosting this year. In 2019, we had it at the Islamic Center of Canale Valley. I think you remember, Imam, and it was a great event. We enjoyed sitting at tables together and eating, and we make sure that people get sorted out in different faiths so that we can share our conversation and discussions. And we know that when people eat together, barriers come down, understanding grows, and trust grows. So that is part of what Ventura County Interfaith is about. So be looking for that information on the Feast of Faiths and the ability to pay via PayPal. And then we will be having a speaker in November on Native American faiths or beliefs. So we're looking forward to that. Just giving you a preview. Yes, ma'am. Bonnie?
Just to let you know, September 27th is Rosh Hashanah.
Yes, we discussed with Rabbi Mike, and he thought everybody would be done at the end of the day.
Oh, okay, that's right. Only I do, I go 2 days.
Okay,
go
so it's
2
on it's on a Sunday. So it should be on a Sunday. I apologize. The
Then
face to
then
face,
it's a little bit then it's before, because I
October
have down,
23rd is on a Sunday.
no, September, October is fine. There's
Okay.
September 26th and 27th
Oh,
is the New
okay.
Year.
Okay. Well, we meet at 7 and it's after sundown.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
you're talking about two different
it's
days.
2 days. It's 2 days. It's the 26th and the 27th.
Right, Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so we'll talk about it later, Bonnie.
They don't break, because the reason, by the way, in America, we have it 2 days, and in Israel, it's 1 day, is because we're trying to make up the difference in time. Because in Israel, it's all 1 day. Just to
Ah.
let you know that it's 1 day, but in America, because we're on a different time zone, we make it 2 days.
Oh,
Terry, I put the survey back in the chat.
okay. Survey back in the chat. Please click on that. Please do that if you haven't. It gives us an idea of what you think and what we can do better. And then I appreciate the speakers. And Karsten, you were so worried about speaking from your heart. Believe me, that's what it's about. So I'm glad you did that. And Katya, excellent. And Imam, always good. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the questions too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you didn't even get to experience Rabbi Mike. I'm going to find out where he was. He comes up with great questions. So, thank you. Thank you very, very much. And we will see you, I hope, those who can attend in September, and those who can't, I understand.